We think modern therapy is a new invention. But what if a scholar in the 900s already described ideas that sound like CBT, talk therapy, and the mind-body connection? Not as vague philosophy. As practical guidance for healing. And most people have never heard his name. Today, you'll see why Abu Zayd al Balkhi deserves a place in the history of mental health. Abu Zayd al Balkhi was a Persian Muslim scholar and polymath who lived in the 9th to early 10th century. This was the Abbasid era, a time of intense learning and translation, when older Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge was being studied and reshaped in Arabic. He was born around the year 850 in the region of Balkh, in what is now Afghanistan. We don't have a detailed biography of his daily life. But we do know he wasn't limited to one field. He studied geography, and was linked to map-making traditions in his region. He also wrote about medicine, Arabic language, philosophy, theology, literature, mathematics, astronomy, and more. Some accounts say he produced dozens of works. At some point, he traveled to Baghdad, the intellectual center of that world, and studied with the philosopher al-Kindi. Then he returned to Balkh, worked as a scribe, and continued writing. And the few descriptions we have paint him as reserved and quiet. Which makes this next part even more interesting. Because one of his works shows an unusually sharp understanding of what it feels like to struggle inside your own mind. The book is called Masalih al Abdan wa al Anfus. In English, it's often translated as Sustenance for the Body and the Soul. It's a medical work with two parts. Part 1 focuses mostly on physical health and the medicine of its time. Some of the science there is outdated by modern standards. But some advice is timeless, like prevention through habits, diet, and movement. Part 2 is the real surprise. It's dedicated to what we would call mental health, or psychological health. And al Balkhi makes a point that sounds obvious now, but wasn't treated as obvious back then. The mind and body affect each other. If the body suffers, the mind can lose strength and clarity. If the mind suffers, the body can lose energy, pleasure, and even physical health. He even says, in plain terms, that psychological pain can lead to bodily illness. This mind-body link is a pillar in modern healthcare conversations. But al Balkhi is putting it front and center in the 900s. Then he does something very modern in spirit. He starts classifying mental struggles into recognizable categories. He discusses anger, fear and panic, sadness and depression, and obsessive, intrusive thinking that strongly resembles what we call OCD today. He also suggests a broader theory. He argues that anxiety sits underneath many of these struggles. That fear is obvious, but even anger can begin as anxious tension, and then flip into aggression. You don't have to agree with his exact model. What matters is the method. He maps the inner world. Then he offers treatment strategies. Over and over, he returns to one core idea. Treatment can be external and internal. External help includes support from another person. Internal work includes habits and mental tools. That is basically the blueprint of modern support. Relationships, routines, and cognitive strategies. Now let's look at depression, because this is one of the biggest, how did he know that, moments. Al Balkhi describes two types of depression. First, the type with a clear cause. A death in the family. A loss of wealth. A painful life event. That sadness makes sense as a human response. Then he describes another type. A distress and gloom that descends without a clear reason. No obvious trigger. But it still shuts down motivation, enjoyment, and energy. That description matches what many people today recognize as clinical depression, where the experience is not simply a reaction to an external event. And this matters for a modern audience. Because a lot of people feel guilt, or confusion, and think, I have no reason to feel this way. Al Balkhi's framework quietly validates a difficult truth. Sometimes the cause is not obvious, and the suffering is still real. When he explains the physical side, he uses the medical framework of his era, so the biology is not modern. But the key idea is striking. Some depression can have a bodily component. And the best approach should address both the physical side and the psychological side. That balanced logic feels familiar today. He then recommends something that sounds simple, but can be powerful. Gentle, encouraging conversation. Support that brings warmth back into a gloomy state. He also mentions listening to music and doing emotionally uplifting activities, as ways to help restore inner energy. Not as magic. As practical support. Now here is one of his strongest ideas about healing. He argues that when you're in psychological pain, relying only on your own inner talk can be harder than people realize. Not because you're weak. Because distress can overpower clear thinking. It hijacks attention. It narrows the mind. And in that state, another person's perspective can do what you cannot do alone. He gives 2 reasons. First, people often accept from others what they don't accept from themselves. Second, when someone is overpowered by painful inner symptoms, they can't clearly think how to overcome them. So they need others to show the way to recovery. That is an early argument for talk therapy. Not in a modern clinical system, but in a human system. Trusted conversation, counseling, guidance, and calming the agitated soul. He also offers an internal tool. When you are in a good state, save helpful thoughts for later. Like putting them in your pocket. So when you feel bad, you can pull those thoughts out and use them. It's not a complete solution by itself. But it's recognizable as a cognitive strategy. Prepare when you're well, so you're not starting from zero when you're not. Now we get to fear and panic. And this is where it gets surprisingly close to modern CBT. In modern therapy, one of the most effective approaches for many fears is exposure therapy. The basic loop looks like this. A scary thought triggers fear. Fear triggers avoidance. Avoidance teaches the brain, this is dangerous. And that makes fear stronger next time. Exposure breaks the loop by safely facing what you fear until your nervous system learns that it is not as dangerous as it predicts. Al Balkhi describes something extremely close to this logic. He says the fear created by expectation is often greater than the real experience, even if the feared event happens. Then he gives a metaphor that is almost perfect. He says the things that frighten people can be like a thick fog. From the outside, it looks solid, black, and trapping. But if you dare to enter it, you discover it is simply moist air. Not a wall. Not a prison. Just mist. And then he recommends repeated exposure. Again and again. Until familiarity reduces fear and panic. This is not just, be brave. It's the idea of training the senses through repetition so the fear response weakens over time. Practice. Adaptation. Learning. That's why people say his description could fit inside a modern exposure therapy manual. Finally, the book moves into obsessive and intrusive thoughts. He uses the language of whisperings. But his description is not a simple supernatural explanation. It reads like a psychological description of obsessive spirals. He describes repetitive, distressing thoughts that produce apprehension and unhappiness. To the point that a person can lose the ability to enjoy life and focus on daily tasks. He also captures a very specific experience that many people with intrusive thoughts recognize. As anxiety intensifies, distant possibilities can start to feel imminent. Not to your rational brain. To your nervous system. It can feel like danger is about to happen. Or like something awful has already happened. That sensation hijacks attention. It pulls you out of conversation. It blocks enjoyment. It makes social life harder. He compares it to recurring nightmares. But in this case, the nightmare happens in the daytime, while you're awake. That is a remarkably accurate way to describe what it feels like. For coping, he returns to earlier tools. External support through conversation and counseling. Internal tools that reduce isolation. And practical structure. Don't be alone too much. Spend time with people you enjoy. Stay engaged with work, or meaningful activity, so your mind has less empty space to spiral. This is not saying, stay busy and you're cured. It's pointing to a practical truth. When you're trapped in loops, connection and structure can reduce the room those loops have to grow. He also frames acceptance in religious terms, trusting God and accepting what life brings. But even if you remove the theological language, the psychological core still holds. Accept that life contains both pain and pleasure. Stop fighting for total control over thoughts and feelings. And learn to live with predispositions rather than fearing them every time they show up. One of his most comforting ideas is this. Understanding the origin of your symptoms can reduce fear. A diagnosis can be calming because it tells you, this has happened before. It has a pattern. It will pass. It does not mean I am broken. He compares it to living with a chronic physical condition. You learn the pattern. You adapt. You stop panicking every time it appears. Now, none of this replaces modern mental health care. This is history, not medical advice. But it does change the story we tell about where mental health knowledge comes from. Because al Balkhi wasn't writing vague inspiration. He was building a practical framework. Categories. Causes. Treatments. And he did it in a way that can still speak to a modern reader. The work became more widely known through later scholarship. And an English translation by Malik Badri helped make the text accessible. If you're curious, it's short enough to actually read. And if this taught you anything, let it be this. The history of psychology is bigger than the standard timeline we're taught. If you want more content like this, subscribe. And if someone in your life loves psychology, therapy, or history, send them this. Because some of the most surprising ideas are the ones we forgot we already had.